You were never meant to see this. Behind the marble columns and sun-drenched forums, past the noble busts and grand epics, there was another Rome, one that didn't wear laurel wreaths. It wore masks. One that didn't speak in Latin. It moaned, wept, and bled in silence. No historian tells you what happened behind the velvet curtains of the triclinium, where girls with hollow eyes poured wine with trembling hands, or how laughter at imperial banquets often drowned out the cries that rose from beneath the floorboards. But tonight, you will see it. You will see what they did in the shadows, in the name of power, pleasure, and something far more terrifying, tradition. It begins with a room, candle-lit, silent. The scent of rose oil is thick as blood. A boy, maybe 12, stands still as a statue, while a man, draped in purple and gold, circles him like a priest preparing a sacrifice. The boy has been bathed, perfumed, trained, not to speak, to resist, only to obey. Somewhere nearby, senators toast the emperor's generosity. This is not fiction. This is Roman law. In Rome, nothing was too sacred to corrupt. Not marriage, not childhood, not the body itself. Sex was not an act of love. It was a language of power, one spoken fluently by emperors, generals, and priests alike. And they didn't whisper, though wrote it on the walls, painted it in bathhouses, etched it into coins. There was no shame, only hierarchy. To be penetrated was to be dominated. To dominate was to reign. Gender was irrelevant. Consent was irrelevant. Age was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was control. And the cost of that control? Everything. A slave girl could be rented out as entertainment between dinner courses. Her virginity auctioned off like a novelty. Her silence was insured by the blade at her back. A boy captured in war might be forced to serve as a cup-bearer, a polite term for something far darker. A living gift passed between noblemen, broken in body before he'd learned to read. These horrors weren't hidden. They were expected. In the reign of Emperor Tiberius, villas were stocked with children trained for marine games, a phrase as innocent as it was monstrous. Naked, greased, and taught to swim between the emperor's legs, while he watched from above, laughing. Caligula, renamed months after his lovers, married his sister and forced senators' wives into public brothels, then made their husbands watch. These were the rulers of the known world, and no one stopped them, because in Rome, depravity was not a sign of weakness, it was proof of dominance. The more unnatural your appetites, the more power you must hold to indulge them without consequence, and the consequences, they were always paid by someone else. A girl of 13, wed to a man thrice her age, expected to please him or be returned. Damaged goods. A boy eunuch, castrated before his voice could deepen, dressed in bridal silk for the amusement of Nero's court. An enslaved child branded as useful, not for his labor, but for his compliance. And still, the poets sang. Still, the mosaics gleamed. Still, the statues stood tall, hiding the screams in polished marble. If you visited Rome today, you'd see the ruins, the grandeur, the legacy. But you wouldn't see the girl whose mouth was sewn shut to ensure discretion. You wouldn't see the boy buried in a garden under the fountain because he embarrassed the guest. You wouldn't see the thousands who died never knowing they had the right to say no, because their stories were erased, deliberately. What remains are whispers, in graffiti, in lost scrolls, in the disturbed expressions of forgotten frescoes. They tell of evenings where guests watched chained bodies reenact myths for sport, of masked gatherings where no name was spoken aloud, of flesh carved not for punishment, but for entertainment, of cries mistaken for ceremony. This was not an empire of men, it was an empire of appetites. And once you understand what Rome truly celebrated behind its closed doors, the rest begins to make sense. The collapse, the madness, the rot. Because no civilization can gorge itself on suffering forever and survive. It begins as a theater. It ends as blood. And if you think this is just history, you're not paying attention, because the ghosts of Rome are still here. In systems, in silence, in the way power still bends pleasure into punishment and calls it tradition. So tonight, you'll step into the room, you'll light the oil lamp, and you'll see Rome as it was, not as a city. But I'm hungry. To walk through a Roman villa was to walk through a house of mirrors. Everything glistened, the polished marble floors, the mosaic ceilings, the slave girls oiled for display. But behind every elegant sculpture, behind every gilded goblet, was a silence so carefully trained it no longer sounded like silence. It sounded like loyalty, like duty, like civilization. But it was terror, because the horror of Roman sexual customs wasn't only in what was done. It was in how accepted it was, how expected, how institutionalized. This wasn't the behavior of a few corrupt elites. This was the fabric of Roman identity, a structure so dense and ancient it could suffocate you without ever raising its voice. There were no safe places in Rome. Not temples, not homes, not marriages. Not childhood. Everything, everyone, had a price. And the currency was obedience. Consider this. At age 12, a Roman girl was of marriageable age. That was the word they used. Marriageable. Not a child, not protected, just available. If her father willed it, she could be sold off in exchange for land, livestock, or favor. And once married, she ceased to exist in the legal sense. Her body, her mind, her voice all belonged to her husband. Her sole duty? Obey, serve, bear sons. But not all girls were chosen for marriage. Some were chosen for the lupanar, the brothel. Stripped, numbered, and caged like animals, they were displayed behind stone arches, forced to smile through broken teeth and exhaustion. The men came with tokens, selected them like fruit, and left without names. Some clients returned, some girls didn't. And still, Rome called it commerce. They called it order. Even in literature, girls were often described by what they lacked: modesty, resistance, voice. The ideal woman was silent, still, and soft, a vessel for pleasure, a tool for legacy. And what about the boys? They had their own fate. The most desirable were foreign-born, fair-skinned, and young enough that their features hadn't hardened. These were the ones brought to Rome in chains, shaved, perfumed, and renamed. They were turned into living ornaments, trained to dance, pour wine, laugh at their master's jokes. But above all, they were taught to endure. Endure the groping hands, the drunken advances, the long nights where they were passed between guests like novelty trinkets. Some were castrated to preserve their high-pitched voices, a sound that was considered divine during certain rituals. Others were blinded, so they couldn't look their masters in the eye, and some, the youngest, were simply bred for one purpose: to be watched. Not touched, watched. Because in Rome, voyeurism was as much a performance as politics. There were entire rooms built for observation, peepholes drilled into stone, slatted walls, mirrored floors. And if a boy cried, it was considered bad manners, because Romans believed that pleasure was proof of control, pain was a weakness, empathy was decadence, and the most noble thing a person could do was not feel. Nowhere was this more chilling than in the convivium, the Roman dinner party. Picture it. A grand hall filled with reclining men and naked servants, the air thick with roasted meat, incense, and the heavy perfume of roses, used to disguise the scent of sweat, sex, and vomit. Behind the tables, dancers moved in silence. One mistake and they were punished mid-performance. And beneath the tables, that's where the real entertainment began. Guests brought their own slaves, sometimes children, sometimes animals, sometimes eunuchs dressed in bridal gowns. These weren't after-dinner distractions. They were offerings, tokens of dominance. The host who provided the most shocking pleasure earned the highest praise. And if something went wrong, if a slave bit, resisted, or bled too much, they were dragged out by the hair and replaced. Because in Rome, the show must go on. Even religion bowed to these appetites. In the temples of Venus and Bacchus, sex was ritual. Bodies were sacrificed not on altars, but as altars. Laid bare, anointed with oil, taken in front of a crowd. Young girls were chosen as sacred brides, given to priests who defiled them under the guise of divine union. Boys were dressed as nymphs, made to dance until they collapsed from exhaustion or worse. And when the rites were over, the gods were thanked, but the gods, of course, were made in the image of men who saw no contradiction in worshiping purity while orchestrating perversion. Men who could debate philosophy in the Senate by day, then drown a slave in wine by night, not out of rage, but curiosity. Because what would happen if he stopped breathing, just as he climaxed? These were not sadists hiding in shadows. They were philosophers, statesmen, poets. They wrote laws, they raised sons, they shaped the world. And they believed what they were doing was not just permitted, but civilized. Because Rome wasn't lawless, it was overlawed. Every act, every hierarchy, every cruelty had a rule, a precedent, a justification. Slaves were defined as non-persons in legal texts. Women were seen as vessels of lineage, not individuals. Children belonged to their father, to discipline, to sell, to destroy. And those who tried to speak, who tried to escape, they were erased, literally. Their names removed from records, their likenesses chipped off mosaics. Their stories are buried beneath the marble roads. That's why we don't know their names. Why we call them the girl, the boy, the slave. Because Rome made sure the victims never became people. Only props, and yet the walls remember. In Subura, ancient graffiti still whispers, "He forced me." No one cared. They paid in coins. I paid in blood. His ring was gold. My wrists were not. These aren't echoes. They're warnings. Because Rome didn't fall from outside pressure. It fell from within. Rotted by its own appetite, drunk on its own gods, blind to its own cruelty. And now that you've seen the world they built, we step into it. The doors to the emperor's private chambers were thicker than any others in the palace, not to keep intruders out, but to muffle the sounds within. They were layered in cedar and studded with bronze, polished to a shine so perfect they reflected the torches in distorted flame. Beyond them, Rome's most terrible secrets unfolded nightly beneath silks, behind veils, and on the flesh of the powerless. It was said that to be summoned to the emperor's bedchamber was an honor, but those who returned, if they returned, came back quieter. Changed, sometimes broken beyond words. Because this was not a bedroom, it was a theater, and the emperor was both audience and god. Every emperor brought his own flavor of hunger. Augustus, the founder of the empire, was rumored to keep a circle of virgin girls around him at night, not always for sex, he claimed, but for warmth, a strange, almost pitiful denial. But those who followed him made no such excuses. Tiberius, his successor, retreated from the public eye in his later years, disappearing to the island of Capri. The villa he built there still stands, now sun-bleached and crumbling, but once alive with torches and the sound of splashing water, because that's where he created his playground, his private kingdom of flesh. There, Tiberius kept boys trained as minnows. They were taught to swim between his legs in specially designed pools, nipping at him with their teeth. The sensation, he claimed, mimicked small fish. But these were not fish. These were children. Many were kidnapped, all silenced. Elsewhere in the villa, girls were tied to posts and left for the entertainment of guests, or to be punished for imagined crimes. Tiberius watched from balconies as bodies twisted below him, a god in human form, unmoved by screams. He had a word for it, discipline. But those who served him called it something else, quietly, carefully. They called it death, and still. The Senate looked the other way, because emperors were not bound by the laws of men. They were the law. If Tiberius wanted a child, the child was his. If he wanted to break someone, mentally, physically, permanently, he had the right. No one questioned it. To question it was treason. To disobey was suicide. Then came Caligula. Where Tiberius was cold and methodical, Caligula was pure chaos. He turned the imperial palace into a brothel. He bedded his sisters publicly, then forced the Senate to worship them as goddesses. He invited noblemen's wives to banquets, examined them like cattle, then took them mid-feast while their husbands were commanded to smile and applaud. One day, Caligula declared his horse a consul. Next, he took a child from a market and slit the boy's throat to test the sharpness of his blade. Pleasure and pain blurred for him. He craved reactions more than results. Fear, disgust, adoration. It didn't matter as long as the crowd watched. But even Caligula had patterns. He loved humiliation. He delighted in reversal. To make a man grovel, to turn a noblewoman into a slave, to force the Senate to lick his boots and call it prayer, the court became a stage and no one was safe from the script. He once staged a wedding between two enslaved children, dressing them in royal garments and forcing them to consummate the marriage while the nobles cheered. Then he threw them to the guards for amusement. Their names were never recorded. When Caligula was assassinated, stabbed 30 times by his own guard. Rome let out a breath it hadn't known it was holding. But the horror didn't stop. It simply changed hands. Nero inherited the crown, and with it, the crown's appetite. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, a lover of beauty, but his definition of beauty was violence in disguise. Nero fell in love with a boy named Sporus. The boy was perhaps 13 when he caught Nero's eye, delicate, pale, feminine. To Nero, he resembled his late wife Poppaea, who had died, some say, at Nero's own hands. So Nero did what any emperor might in a city ruled by appetite. He had Sporus castrated, dressed him in Poppaea's gowns, and married him in a public ceremony. Sporus was paraded through the city in bridal veils. He was called empress. He was kissed in front of crowds. And yet he never spoke a word in any surviving text. His silence is louder than history. Rome called it love, but it was possession. A reanimation of a dead wife using a living child. A desperate, grotesque attempt to recreate affection through domination. And no one dared intervene. That's what made Rome's sexual horror so insidious. It wore the masks of love, ritual, spectacle. It looked like a celebration. It felt like entertainment. But underneath was a core of rot so deep it infected everyone who touched it, even the emperors themselves. Because in the end, even gods bleed. Nero died by suicide at the age of 30. His final words, "What an artist dies in me." Caligula's brains spilled across marble. Tiberius choked in his sleep, some say suffocated by a pillow held by his own guards. And in the end, it consumed them. But they weren't the only ones destroyed. Their hunger rippled outward, into homes, temples, marriages, into every corner of Roman life where a person with power faced a person without it. Because once you make cruelty sacred, you never run out of victims. And in Rome, there was always someone lower than you. There were no locks on a Roman child's door, no age of consent, no one to cry to if something happened in the dark. Because in Rome, the dark was not an intruder. It was built into the walls. While the emperor played God in his chambers, the city mirrored him in miniature. Every domus, every villa, every smoky apartment above a tavern was its own little kingdom. And in these private kingdoms, the same rules applied. Power shaped reality. Silence kept you safe. Consent didn't exist. A Roman girl was born into obedience. From the moment she could walk, she was taught to lower her gaze, to move without sound, to fold herself small. By the age of 7, she might be promised to a man she'd never met. By 12, she could be legally married. By 13, she might be bearing his child. Her body still growing, still breaking. But Roman marriage was not a covenant of love. It was a transaction, sealed with coin and lineage. The man received not just a bride, but control. Absolute. He could strike her, isolate her, force himself on her. If she resisted, she risked disgrace. If she reported him, she risked death, because a woman's dishonor stained her entire family. So she stayed silent, and silence bred rot. Even in the most respectable homes, sex was rarely private. Husbands would bring concubines into the marital bed. Slaves were forced to serve wine and watch, or worse, participate. Roman men believed pleasure should not be hidden. It should be witnessed, controlled, displayed, and the most grotesque acts became ritualized through repetition, until no one could remember a time when it was wrong. This was not fringe behavior. It was everyday life. A senator might begin his morning in court, his midday in the forum, and his evening reclined in his atrium, surrounded by half-naked boys fanning him, while his wife sat quietly nearby, stitching her embroidery, pretending not to hear the moans coming from behind the screen. In the eyes of Roman society, she was lucky. At least she had status. At least she wasn't a slave. Because slaves had no name, no protection, no personhood. They were bought not just for labor, but for utility. And one of the most useful slaves was the pure delicatus, a child selected specifically for his appearance, soft-skinned, curly-hailed, foreign preferably, trained to pour wine, sing, play the lyre, and serve in bed. These children were passed between men like trophies. They were gifts, given at weddings, at feasts, as signs of favor. Some were branded with their master's seal. Some had golden collars affixed to their necks, reading, "If found, return me to my master. I belong to him." But not all were decorative. Some were used in public punishment rituals. In a Roman punishment called punitio erotica, an enslaved person, often a child, was publicly restrained and sexually violated as a warning to others. Sometimes it was part of a festival. Sometimes it was done for sport. The crowd would cheer, coins would be tossed, and when it was over, the body would be carried off not as a corpse, but as waste. This wasn't deviant. It was law, because a master could do whatever he wanted with his property. Even in the temples, supposed places of purity, there was no escape. The cults of fertility gods demanded offerings not in gold, but in flesh. The Priapus festivals included processions where enormous wooden phalluses were carried through the streets, followed by women forced to simulate acts of submission in public. The cult of Cybele demanded eunuchs, young men castrated in religious frenzy, their blood seen as sacred. Some were voluntary, many were not. And the most haunting ceremonies? The ones performed at night, masked, torchlit, whispered. The Lupercalia, for example, was a rite in which naked young men ran through the streets striking women with leather thongs. The women were told it would ensure fertility. Some smiled. Some flinched. All were watched. Because that's what Rome did best. It watched. It turned suffering into spectacle. In the gladiator arenas, prisoners were sometimes forced to engage in sexual acts before being slaughtered. In the theater of cruelty, condemned criminals were raped by animals as the crowd roared, a punishment called dematio ad bestias. The screams were part of the show. The more exotic the violence, the greater the applause. But perhaps the most insidious performances were the ones without stages. In private dinner parties, aristocrats played games with their guests, forcing them to guess which of the veiled slaves was male or female, then exposing them, laughing. In others, guests were told to select a companion for the evening. Some chose blindly, only to discover the companion was a blood relative, or a child, or both. And once chosen, there was no refusal. Refusal was shameful. Refusal was a weakness. Refusal was Roman death, not by sword, but by exile, by ridicule, by the erosion of your place in the social order. You see, in Rome, you didn't survive by being good, you survived by being useful, or silent, or invisible. And those who tried to resist, they were erased. There's a mosaic fragment from Pompeii, scorched but intact. It depicts a woman on her knees, head bowed, surrounded by 4 men. It is finely crafted, the muscles, the folds of the fabric, the glint of gold. But her face is scratched out, deliberately, as if someone wanted to remember the act but forget the victim. This was Roman memory, not what happened, only what pleased. And yet, there were moments, flickers of rebellion, a poem by a slave girl found etched in charcoal on a villa wall. He calls me pet. I piss in his wine. A line from a disgraced noblewoman's letter. They say I shamed the gods, but I only said no. A senator's wife, arrested for speaking out against a temple rite, disappeared from records. But her name reappears, faintly, in graffiti beneath a bridge. Livia was right. They were whispers. But whispers build. Whispers rot stone. And though the empire thrived, its heart blackened. What was once a ritual became a parody. What was once power became addiction. By the time Nero danced on stage as a goddess and forced the senators to cheer, Rome had eaten itself from the inside. Because you cannot build eternity on the backs of broken children. You cannot call horror tradition and expect it to stay buried not forever. And so, beneath the marble and the columns and the songs of glory, the ground began to crack. The empire would fall, not from swords, not from barbarians, but from its own sickness, from the screams it refused to hear, from the blood it forgot how to wash away. We go to weddings, to the sacrifices, to the quiet girls in bridal veils who never lived long enough to become wives, because if you think you've seen the worst of Rome, you haven't even looked at the altar. Dressed her in white, not for purity but for death. The Roman bridal veil, flammeum, was the color of flame, bright red-orange, like the blood that would stain the sheets by morning. It covered her like a shroud, hiding not just her face, but her fear. She was 12, maybe 13. Her hands trembled as they tied the woolen belt around her waist. No one asked if it was too tight. No one asked if she wanted this, because Roman marriage was not a promise. It was a transaction. And the bride? She was the proof of purchase. The wedding procession moved through the streets with drums and flutes. People cheered, coins were thrown. A torchbearer led the way, and behind him came the girl, dressed like a woman, surrounded by strangers. Her mother wept softly. Her father smiled. He had chosen well, he believed. A wealthy older husband, a fine family name, a good match. No one looked her in the eyes. Not when they arrived at the groom's house, not when she was carried across the threshold, not when the door was shut behind her, because what happened next was not to be spoken of, only assumed. The wedding night in ancient Rome was a legal event. The consummation of the marriage was not just expected, it was required. If the girl bled, it was considered a sign of virtue. If she didn't, it was cause for shame, for punishment. And the man, he was free to do as he pleased. She was now his property. Some girls survived, many did not. Roman physicians wrote of broken hips, ruptured organs, fatal hemorrhaging, but they didn't use words like child. They called them wives. And what if the groom was a man of power? A senator, a general, an aging aristocrat? The marriage became theater. The girl was not a partner, she was a symbol of fertility, of submission, of wealth. She was paraded at feasts, displayed like fine wine. Sometimes she was replaced by mourning, discarded if she cried, or worse, if she died before she could conceive. One story, buried in a forgotten Roman scroll, tells of a girl named Vibia. She was 11 when she was promised to a man in his 60s, a governor with a reputation for cruelty. On her wedding night, she was dressed in a gold-stitched tunic and laid on a bed of flowers. Guests waited outside, listening. After an hour, the groom emerged, smiling. But the girl never stood again. They said it was her delicate constitution. They buried her quietly. By the next season, the governor was wed again. In elite circles, the wedding night became a rite of power, a public performance of private domination. Some noblemen invited witnesses. Others documented the act with poems, with art, with detailed letters to friends. One letter survives from a Roman noble who wrote, "She screamed at first, then she understood. By dawn she was quiet," a good sign. This wasn't seen as abuse, it was seen as victory for the Romans. Sex was never mutual. It was always something done to someone. And on a wedding night, it was dressed in ritual, veiled in ceremony, framed as destiny. But beneath it all, it was conquest. And what of love? Love had no place in Roman marriage. If a man desired love, he sought it elsewhere, with concubines, with boys, with prostitutes trained to mimic affection. His wife was for lineage, for legacy, for hosting guests. She was expected to endure, to birth children, to never raise her voice. But some did. There are whispers of Roman brides who fled, who threw themselves into wells, into rivers, rather than endure the bridal bed. Of girls who poisoned their husbands, who disappeared in the night. Their stories are rare, often erased, but sometimes scratched into stone by sympathetic hands. In wealthier homes, where girls could read, some found refuge in books, learning the poetry of Sappho, the resistance of Lucretia, who took her own life after being violated, sparking a rebellion that toppled a king. Lucretia became a symbol of virtue, but her story was used to teach obedience, not defiance. They praised her silence, her sacrifice, her purity unto death. That was the cruelest irony of all. Rome celebrated the suffering of women, but only when it served the myth. The girl who endured abuse was called loyal. The one who resisted was called hysterical. The one who took her own life was called noble. The one who survived, she was forgotten. And this wasn't limited to noble homes. Among the poor, girls were sold as brides for food, for shelter, for political favors. In some cases, marriage was declared with nothing more than a nod and a shared bed. The girl was expected to serve, to please, to never complain. If she did, she was punished, beaten, banished, or sold again, even in death. Their stories were not their own. Tombstones spoke only of the husbands. Here lies Marcus's wife, obedient and fruitful. Rarely was her name carved in full. Rarely was her age noted. Rarely was there mention of what she endured. And yet, the ruins remember. In Pompeii, a house was found with frescoes of a wedding ceremony, but on the floor beneath the main hall, archaeologists discovered a small skeleton. Female, likely 10 to 12 years old. No records of her name, no records of her burial, just bones, broken in ways that suggested trauma, and a single earring near the skull. Was she a bride? Was she an offering? Or just another girl swallowed by the system? No one can say. But Rome had many such ghosts, because in a city where weddings were performances, and the bridal bed was a proving ground, the body of a girl was never hers to begin with. It belonged to her father, then to her husband, then, if she survived long enough, to her sons. Never to herself, and so the veil was passed down, from mother to daughter, blood-stained and red, a legacy not of love but of survival. Some wore it and lived, some wore it and died, but all wore it in silence, because in Rome, a woman's first lesson was how not to speak. Rome did not die with a scream. It died with a smile. Gilded, rehearsed, and stained with blood, in its final century, the empire began to rot from the inside, not with fire, not with invasion, but with pleasure, endless, escalating, bottomless pleasure, the kind of pleasure that isn't really pleasure at all, just cruelty, repeated until it loses meaning. By then, even the shadows had grown tired of watching. The emperors came and went, some mad, some monstrous, some merely bored. Each pushed the boundaries further, digging deeper into the abyss of human submission. One married a Vestal virgin, desecrating the temple. Another performed a mock childbirth in public, dressed in silk, wailing as a slave delivered a gemstone from between his legs. It wasn't scandal anymore. It was theater. And every Roman, every senator, every priest, every merchant played their part, because the only thing more dangerous than a corrupt emperor was a people willing to normalize him. But this was never just about emperors. It was about the world they built and the children they buried beneath it. Because for every marble arch, there was a broken wrist behind it. For every poem of longing, a violated child who could not write. For every triumphal statue a woman stitched silent so her screams wouldn't disrupt the ceremony, Rome measured its glory in stone, in conquest, in centuries of civilization. But it never measured was the cost. Because what happens when cruelty becomes sacred? When the altar demands not faith, but flesh? You get a world where temples echo with forced moans, where marriage is a transaction carved into a child's pelvis, where the empire's greatness is fed by the tears of its forgotten, the ones with no names, no rights, and no escape. And if you're wondering where those stories went, the answer is simple. They were never meant to survive, Roman historians. Nearly all men, nearly all elite wrote of wars and treaties, not the wedding beds of 12-year-olds or the screams behind the lupanars. They documented who wore what at the games, who debated in the Senate, who was honored by which god. But they did not write down the name of the girl who was sold 3 times by 15, or the boy who drowned himself in the Tiber rather than return to his master's bed. You won't find them in scrolls, but you'll find them in the cracks of history, in the ashes of Pompeii, where 2 skeletons were found chained together in a cellar, one large, one heartbreakingly small, in the graffiti of a bathhouse that reads, "I was a gift, I never said yes," in the temple stone where a woman carved a single word before death: enough. These are the voices Rome tried to silence. But silence is fragile, and now you've heard them. You've seen what Rome was. Not just an empire of laws and learning, but of hunger. A hunger so vast it consumed people, then erased the bones. And the most terrifying part? It didn't disappear. Because this kind of power, the kind that feasts on silence, doesn't need to wear a toga. It doesn't need an emperor. It survives in every system that says, she asked for it. In every courtroom where status outweighs truth. In every ceremony where pain is disguised as tradition, the ghost of Rome is still here. It lives in the way we teach history, glorifying conquest while skipping the screams. It lives in the celebration of genius without asking, who did they hurt to get there? It lives in every unchecked hand that believes power gives it the right to touch, to take, to destroy. Rome is not ancient, it's eternal, because empires don't fall in flames, they fall in applause. So if you want to honor the ones Rome tried to erase, the brides who never grew old, the boys who served wine until their hands stopped shaking, the women who learned how to bleed quietly. You don't need statues. You just need to remember that behind every great civilization, there are rooms we were never meant to open. You just opened one. And now that you've seen what was inside, close the door. But don't forget the smell. The moment Rome collapsed was not marked by fire. It wasn't the sack of the city or the fall of an emperor. It wasn't even a war. It was a night. Ordinary, forgotten, never recorded, when no one flinched at the sound of a child screaming behind a villa wall. It was the moment cruelty became background noise. That was the shift, not from glory to ruin, but from spectacle to numbness, from ritual to reflex. When the empire no longer needed emperors to commit its horrors, when every home became a stage, when domination no longer shocked, it soothed. That's how you know something has rotted beyond repair. When people stopped noticing the smell, the rot wasn't just in the palaces. It was in the temples, the law courts, the bedrooms, the kitchens. It was in the laughter at dinner, in the silence of the enslaved, in the trembling hands of a bride not yet a woman. It was in the comfort of men who believed they were gods. Rome didn't fall. It withered from the inside out. And the world inherited its bones because the rituals didn't dissipate. They changed masks. They left the togas behind. The same logic. That power justifies anything. That status grants access. That silence is consent. Found new homes, new languages, new victims. You can still hear it. In stories that begin with, "She was asking for it." In systems that bury truth under reputation. In institutions that protect predators because they wear the right robes. Rome's fall was never about bricks and stone. It was about the moment we stopped seeing victims as people. That was the break, the point of no return. And by the time we noticed, we were already living in the empire's shadow. There comes a moment, after the horror, after the history, after the details have clawed their way under your skin, when you realize the most haunting thing about ancient Rome isn't what it did, it's how easy it was to look away. How many people knew, heard, saw, participated, and simply adjusted, dined beside the abuse, slept in villas built on suffering, laughed as children performed. They prayed to gods carved in the likeness of rapists. They passed laws that turned pain into currency, and they taught their sons to do the same. Because in Rome, the most valuable skill wasn't courage, it was compliance. And that is where the emotional weight of this story lands. Not in the shock of what happened, but in the echo of its acceptance. You ask yourself, how could they? But the question should be, how often do we still? That's what makes this story unbearable and unshakable, because it isn't ancient, it's familiar. The systems that protected Rome's cruelty weren't primitive. They were clever. They used language, legality, religion, performance. They made the monstrous feel civilized, they turned abuse into ritual, and they made the victims feel ashamed for surviving. How many Roman girls were forced to smile in paintings? How many enslaved boys were dressed in gold and told they were special? How many men were praised not for kindness, but for the depth of their appetite? And when those victims wept or screamed or broke under the weight of what had been done to them, the world called them ungrateful, weak, hysterical. That is the darkest truth of all. Rome didn't just hurt people. It taught them to blame themselves for bleeding. That is the root of long-lasting trauma. When pain isn't just inflicted, it's justified. When a child learns their body is not their own. When a woman is taught that silence is survival. When a slave is punished for resisting and praised for obedience. This isn't history for textbooks, it's the psychology of submission. The way systems train you to disappear in plain sight, to thank your abuser for feeding you, to polish the chains, to perform affection, to laugh at jokes meant to humiliate you, until one day you forget what it was like to want anything but invisibility. And still, within that silence, there was grief. There was rage. There were victims who whispered to each other in kitchens, in alleys, in bathhouses, who carved their pain into stone, who ran, who resisted, who died on their own terms. We never got their names, but they existed, and we carry their emotional truth in our bones, because the world that normalized them still touches ours. The moral resonance is not a call to pity. It is a demand to see, to stop worshiping the empire without looking at what it cost, to stop romanticizing greatness without naming the bodies buried beneath it, to understand that civilization is not measured by power, but by mercy, and that the more we glorify conquest without questioning its price, the more we repeat the rot that undid Rome from the inside. So what now? Now we sit with it. Not as historians, not as tourists, but as inheritors of a world that still struggles with power, with silence, with how easily we pretend not to see. Rome ended, but the systems it perfected, domination disguised as discipline, violence passed off as culture, pleasure as punishment, still haunt boardrooms, bedrooms, courtrooms, headlines. Story is not a condemnation of the past. It's a mirror for the present. It asks, who do we still allow to suffer quietly? Who do we pretend has a choice when they don't? What rituals do we still perform without asking what they cost the ones at the bottom? The emotional weight of this isn't just sorrow, it's my responsibility. To remember, to name, to refuse silence, because silence, not cruelty, was the true architect of Rome's horror. And silence is the most dangerous thing we can still carry forward. Rome did not fall in flames. It withered in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows a scream no one acknowledges, the kind that thickens in the air like smoke. Heavy, choking, everywhere. And yet, unseen, this was the final act of the Roman Empire. Not war, not collapse, but forgetting. They forgot the girls who bled on their wedding nights. They forgot the boys who served wine on trembling legs, too afraid to speak. They forgot the slaves who were passed from hand to hand like warm silver. And they told the world, we were glorious. They built statues to their cruelty and called it civilization. They wrote laws around rape and called it property. They put children in cages, in beds, in temples, and called it order. And we believed them, because it's easier to love Rome in stone than to confront it in blood. Easier to trace the columns than the scars. Easier to admire the empire than to mourn its victims. But the truth is this: what Rome built was not eternal. What Rome built was a lie, and beneath that lie, buried under the weight of myth and marble, are bones. Small bones, silent ones, bones that still remember what the world refuses to say out loud. Because Rome didn't just conquer land, it conquered the body. It broke people and taught them not just to obey but to perform, to smile through pain, to call rape consummation, to call silence duty, to call survival loyalty. And worst of all, it taught them to thank the hand that hurt them. That is Rome's real legacy. Invisible obedience. Brutality dressed in silk. Cruelty scripted into ceremony. That's why it survived so long. Not because it was strong, but because it made everyone complicit. The father who married off his daughter to secure a trade deal. The senator who sipped wine while a slave screamed behind the curtain. The priest who called a child's blood holy. The crowd who applauded while a boy was destroyed in the arena. And now, you've seen it. You've stepped behind the curtain. You've walked through the villa where girls were silenced with gold. You've sat at the feast where pain was the dessert. You've heard the laughter that drowned out the begging. So what do you do with that? Because this story was never just about the past. Rome is not dead. Rome is reflected in every system that protects the powerful, in every institution that still calls silence professionalism, in every ritual we repeat without asking who it harms. You see, empires don't die because they are defeated. They die because they believe no one will ever hold them accountable. Rome believed that, and so it forgot the cost. But bones remember. Stones remember. So do the ghosts that history tried to erase. The girl who whispered no, but wasn't allowed to mean it. The boy who ran, but was dragged back because he belonged to the house. The slave who bit down on her own tongue rather than scream again, and are here, in the ashes, in the fragments, in the red dust beneath the mosaics. And now, they are in you. Because once you've seen this, once you know what the empire really was, you carry it. You carry the shame it refused. You carry the truth buried. You carry the memory that history tried to silence. And that's the point. You are the reckoning not in rage, in remembrance, not in vengeance, in the courage to see clearly and refuse to look away. Because if we do not confront what Rome really was, we will build it again. not in marble, but in systems, in policy, in culture. In homes where the door closes and no one asks what happened after Rome was not about the sword. It was about the hand that touches without asking, the mouth that calls abuse discipline, the silence that follows because someone powerful says, "That's how it's always been. That's what we inherited." But inheritance is not destiny. We do not have to repeat what we refuse to glorify. We do not have to love what we finally dare to name. And now we have named it. Clearly, brutally, without flinching. So if you're still here, if your stomach turned, if your heart sank, if your hands clenched, good. It means you're awake. It means Rome does not get the final word. You do. They said it was civilization. We saw the truth. They said it was glory. We saw the cost. They said it was history. We heard the screams. Rome will not rise again, not in silence, not while we remember.